Welcome to the pre-colonial video of the history of New Zealand's fishing industry. We'll start with the arrival of humans, because that's what we're interested in with fisheries management, when Maori arrived. And essentially the New Zealand wilderness was untouched. Resources were open for exploitation and colonization, and the Maori population grew as they took advantage of this. Eventually it grew to the point where there was competition amongst different peoples. Different canoes arrived, and iwis set up boundaries, and those territories were inclusive of fishing grounds, not just terrestrial but also over the water, usually marked with rocks, islands, headlands. And that's when fisheries management, Aotearoa, was born. So did the Maori have an impact on local populations when they arrived? We know they did. We can look back at the history of Maori diets by looking at these Middens, which are essentially trash pits, and a lot of archaeology is looking through trash pits. And some of the impacts that they might have had were the Maori dog was introduced, the kuri, and that is not only a dog that was used as a food resource, but it was also as a hunter and as a companion, and they, as we know, were very hard on populations of things like kiwi. The Polynesian rat, the first rat, came with Maori, and between the dogs, the rats, and humans, in the before Europeans arrived, at least 20 species of birds, several wetas, an unknown number of frogs, lizards of the forest floor were all driven to extinction. And we know that Maori hunted moa, and they did that often by burning forest cover, and that dropped from 85% to 50% over the whole of the North Island over the time from when Maori arrived to when Europeans arrived. And if we look at snapper, it's interesting that they disappeared from South Island Middens about 400 years ago. I'll just read a little info. If you look at the early archaeological sites, particularly in Marlborough, you can trace the history as they exploited larger game animals, and then they started with moa bones, geese, swans, adze-bills, takahe, shags, large penguins, New Zealand sea lions, and fur seals. But in later archaeological sites from the 14th century on, the larger vertebrates are absent or uncommon. So they show a growing independence on shellfish, fish, eels, and plants. And some later middens, such as at the mouth of the Shag River in Otago, show that smaller shellfish were taken as the larger ones became locally depleted. So you can look through the trash pits from the earlier times to the later times and find how diets varied. So there were impacts on local populations. Here again, here's a map of what the forest would have looked like 1000 AD, and then well, how much area was forested in 1000 AD, and how much forested was forested in 1840. You can see big impacts in the South Island where areas were burned for moa hunting. Here is an elephant seal that at one point was widespread in New Zealand, and the Hooker's sea lion, also widespread throughout the whole of New Zealand. And these were gone from the main islands by 1500, and gone from Stewart Island by 1800. So they were all pretty much eaten by Maori before New Zealand, or before Europeans arrived. So now that we're still impacting them, 14 to 123 hooker sea lions are killed each year in the squid fishery. All right, New Zealand fur seal. They're starting to make a comeback, but before colonization, there were 1 to 2 million. And by 1500, so well before our Europeans arrived, they were gone from the North Island. There were still populations in the South Island. But Europeans arrived and started sealing in earnest, making quite an industry out of it. And they had driven the population down to as low as 50,000, and at which time they were protected by law. But after protection by law, they bred and increased and reached the North Island for the first time in 400 years, about 25 years ago. And now we have populations of fur seals established and making a comeback, established around here on Plate Island, at Maori Island, and we see them regularly even at Rabbit Island and down around the Mount sometimes. So about 1,200 of these are killed in fishing operations, mostly in trawling every year. There is a device called a sled or a TED, sea lion exclusion device, or a turtle exclusion device, which allows, it's a big grate that can shunt the large animals out of these out of the trawl net, and those are coming into more widespread use. Whaling. So before Europeans arrived, the whale populations were virtually untouched in New Zealand, and some of the large populations were sperm whales, the southern right whale, so virtually wiped out in 15 years. Okay, and there are only about 250 to 350 today, possibly more. They seem to be growing. The population seems to be doing all right. We even had a southern right whale just off of Rabbit Island a couple years back. Humpback whales were very common and caught up until the 1950s in the Cook Strait. Bryde's whale or Brooder's whale. They're seen even now in the Hauraki Gulf commonly, but there were large populations before extensive whaling in the 1800s. Pilot whales were even whaled. These small creatures. These are the ones that are most often stranded in New Zealand. And between 1822 and 1831, almost 222,000 whales were killed in New Zealand waters, and 30,000 annually from the 1830s to the 1860s. There's a quote you can stop and look at which describes the whaling center in the Bay of Islands.